Right on time. So I'm Adam Maltese, and I will be introducing our guest speaker for today, Lisa Brahms, who comes to us from the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh via where she spends a lot of her time in Vermont, and previous than that via Mexico and some other cool, exciting places. I am not going to do a full introduction for Lisa because it essentially would be impossible to try to capture everything that she does in the realm of both museum education and making. But in case you care about these things, she did her graduate work at Pitt with Kevin Crowley, who does a lot of work in informal learning. She, for a number of years, and she'll tell you how many, has been at the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh. If you haven't been there, it's an awesome museum. It's getting bigger in the next week or two with a new additional facility that they're adding on board. And their makerspace there, Make Shop, is one of the sort of preeminent makerspaces that's existed for a number of years now, really as one of the leaders in the field. And then another thing, and this is, I don't think she's going to touch on this at all, but it's a fascinating thing that you can snag her next time you see her and talk to her about, is a thing called remake learning, which in the Pittsburgh area is where most or all or many of the informal education spaces in Pittsburgh have come together and tried to network as much as possible so that they know more about what each other are doing. And that's led to a whole number of interesting synergies and projects where they sort of first mapped out the landscape and now are doing more to interconnect those for many reasons, but not the least of which is to better serve the kids in Pittsburgh. And rather than trying to step on each other's toes and fight for programming or fight for kids to visit their programming, thinking more holistically about how they can best serve the kids in that region. Yeah, but that's like a whole nother day's worth of workshops and stuff that she could talk about.
Yeah.
But, so, yeah, I'll pass it on to Lisa, and go ahead.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for having me. This is very exciting. I'm going to, and thank you, Adam, especially for inviting me. So I'm going to be sharing some work with you guys that is very emergent, so it's a little risky, but just so you know, I'm excited to get feedback on this work, and I'm really positioning this work on the side of improvement and practice as opposed to research and theory. There is some theory that we are learning through this, but the real focus for us right now is on creating resources and knowledge that can be used to improve practice, mainly within museums and libraries, but it definitely applies to other learning contexts like school. So who am I? Where do I come from? And what am I going to be talking about today? So I'm Lisa Brahms. I'm the Director of Learning and Research at the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh. I've been there for almost 10 years, which is crazy. I started as a graduate student at Pitt. I was the research fellow at the museum. And with the creation of Make Shop, I quickly became a piece of the puzzle of the museum. And so that eventually led to me becoming the Director of Learning and Research, and Learning and Research becoming a focus of what we do at the museum, which it wasn't before this. So today, I'm just to give you a little bit, I'm going to talk about background, who I am, where I come from, talk about our approach to learning at the museum, really focus on the development of a tool to capture learning for improvement through making. And then a little bit about the implications of this work on practice, like I said, and some next steps for the work. Can you all hear me? I have a quiet voice. Okay. So the Children's Museum, as Adam said, we are a children's museum, and all the things that you might assume that come with that. One important thing to know about us, our design philosophy is play with real stuff, and emphasis on the real stuff as opposed to the play part. The play is really the work that kids and families, people of all ages, are doing with the real stuff of learning. So for us, that often means real materials and tools of creating, of making, of engagement. And so we don't have a lot of primary colors in our space. We really like to create an environment that's very respectful of learners, so that challenges learners, that engages them with a lot of contemporary art. All over our space, we engage a lot of artists, so it's a little bit of a different kind of place as far as what you might assume a children's museum to be. It challenges those assumptions a little bit, and we like to take some risks with those assumptions. And so, making a long time ago, now almost 10 years ago, was one of those risks that we took. I'll get into that. So a learning and research department in a children's museum, you might be like, what's that about? So it started where the director of our institution asked me if I would become the director of education, and I said, well, I'm getting this PhD thing, and I'm really interested in the questions that we ask of learning in our space. And so can we please, I'll say yes to directing our programs, things like that, as long as we can be asking those questions along the way from a research perspective. And so she said, sure, and I said, cool, and we dove in and tried to figure out what that meant as we went along. And what it's come to mean is a separate department at the museum that is a sister department to education and exhibits. But really we focus on the intersection of practice and theory, really working to improve practice, but hopefully advance theory. The big work that we do is this stuff, working alongside practitioners and with practitioners deeply to guide discussion of design to support learning in a real way that is meaningful to those practitioners as well as to the learners. And of course, we seek to influence conversations about learning both within our space, but with across the field. So both the fields of learning in academia, but more so the fields of design to support learning in informal environments and schools. So MakeShop is our makerspace, where it all began. Our executive director calls me the Tsarina of MakeShop. So I've never quite known what that meant, but basically that I was around when this idea emerged, and it sort of was the meeting of a great minds back in 2009, when making was really just becoming a thing as far as education is concerned. And so we partnered with Carnegie Mellon University, the Entertainment Technology Center, and the University of Pittsburgh Center for Learning in Out-of-School Environments, which is Kevin's lab, which that was my window in, and the museum to all bring our expertise together to try and design this thing that could change the world. And in small ways it has, I think, and that's pretty exciting. And so it's a museum-based makerspace. Just to give you a sense of our visitor, our visitors are families, primarily. The average age of our visitor is around 4 or 5 years old. So when we're thinking about learning, we're primarily thinking about the social learning context. Often making for us skews a little bit more in the analog category, really thinking about how kids can manipulate their physical world. And so the digital plays a part, but the analog is a really important piece. So from the very beginning, we wanted MakeShop to be a place where we could understand the learning that was taking place. And so very early on, we got a grant from the Institute for Museum and Library Services to IMLS to understand learning, family learning in museum-based makerspaces. This was one of the first federal grants around learning and making, which is pretty exciting. And what emerged from that was a framework and an approach to learning that we call practice-based. So this is in the family of communities of practice, thinking about the behaviors that people engage in as they're learning. So we look for observable evidence of learner engagement. I often talk about how we focus on the actions and interactions of learners rather than kind of the end result of their learning. So not thinking about the outcomes, but instead on the behaviors that lead to those outcomes. What this has done for us, as I said before, it's created this common language that we can really use that cuts across research and practice in super meaningful ways. And I'll talk a lot about that moving forward. And then, continually, it's a way for us to think about how to support learning through design as a design team. So this is our approach. Through that, we developed this framework empirically. And, we were doing this while the Tinkering Studio was creating their dimensions of learning, the Agency by Design was creating their approach. So you might see things that, you've seen elsewhere. It was kind of an amazing thing. And I can give you links so you can find these elsewhere. You don't have to take lots of notes. But these are those behaviors. These are our learning practices. And these are the things that when we say making, this is what we mean as an organization. When a teaching artist, is designing something and they often use these as a lens to figure out what they're designing for, what they're designing to support. So seek and share resources, that's all about creating ways to collaborate or encouraging people to share expertise. So how do you design to support that in a drop-in space? These are the questions that having these learning practices encourage us to ask. So I'll move on. Like I said, we see them as mediating learning outcomes. So this helps us talk to other people and help explain what we mean by learning. So some of these are outcomes that teachers care about, that school districts care about, that policy might care about. This is what we believe in when it comes to when we design and support. So you can get to developing persistence by tinkering. And that's the way we position our learning practices with respect to the larger conversation. So we had these learning practices. We've used them with a lot of teachers, with a lot of museums, a lot of libraries. And sort of we were following the kind of trajectory of the field and the questions that were being asked. So initially, a lot of questions about what is making, description, years ago. Now we're in a phase, which Adam is a part of, where we're trying to really understand and assess making, trying to measure learning through making. And so we are on that same path. And so what we're trying to do is, through a current IMLS grant that we have, is figure out how you document and assess learning in makerspaces, mainly in museums and libraries. We're trying to create a usable tool for documenting evidence of learning for practitioners. Most tools that are out there, or most methods, are used by researchers or evaluators rather than the practitioners themselves. We're trying to figure out relevant and useful representations of data for improvement. So how do you represent the data so that practitioners can actually use it to inform their changes in their design? And then how do we help practitioners to articulate and communicate the value of making a learning process for the various stakeholders, whether it be themselves, their supervisors, their funders, the field, their partners. And then something that's come out of this work, which has been really, really interesting and fun and very productive, is that we found this to be a really important problem of practice and a goal of what we're doing. So help supporting educators to articulate their own values with respect to making, to identify evidence and engagement of those values. So I'll get into what that means, but rather than the value making, their own values for making. So this is the overarching project. It's called Making Observations. And so the project goals, as articulated in our grant proposal, were to build empirical understanding of making as a learning process, to engage in a process of co-design between research and practice, to develop a suite of tools for assessing learning through making. And we're working to develop both a measurement tool and improvement tools, and I'll get into that. And then to use those tools to create some professional development resources for practitioners. We have an amazing set of partners, and we've been doing this work with these partners so that we can really develop resources that speak to the needs of various audiences across the museum and library spectrum. So Science Museum of Minnesota is a science center. It's fairly large in St. Paul, Minnesota. Chicago Public Library's U Media is an after-school program for teens deep in the heart of urban Chicago. The Montclair Museum of Science is a very small rural science center that kind of skews towards becoming more on the children's museum side. And then Peter Wardrop is my research partner in crime in most things in life, and he is at the University of Wisconsin. So if you know Peter, he's in the ether right now. These are the research questions that are guiding our work. Today I'm going to focus mainly, the work that I'm going to present speaks to mostly this third one. So in what ways does the observational tool influence educator practice? So just to touch on it, I'm not going to really talk about it, but we are developing a measurement tool, a valid and reliable tool, one tool right now, focused on this learning practice, seek and share resources. We used our learning practices of making kind of as like a jumping off point for the work. And the first phase of the work was focused on talking about these with all the partners, as a group, as a network, and trying to understand, do these practices speak to, are they relevant to your context, are they not relevant to your context, which of them is most important? All of them were somewhat relevant, but seek and share resources definitely rose to the top as something that was happening in all contexts, so that the tool that we are creating, we're hoping can be useful mainly by probably evaluators and researchers, in that it will have a very specific protocol and things like that to aid in validity and reliability around seek and share. So if you want to learn more about that, ask me later. But I'm going to really focus on our improvement tools. So we're engaging in a process of co-design around these improvement tools. What we mean by co-design is the iterative development of solutions to practical and complex educational problems in the actual learning environment. This necessarily involves researchers and practitioners. So each of our partners at every site, there are the practitioners, the designers, the educators, and there's also someone who wears the research hat. So I'm working primarily with the Montclair Museum of Science. Caitlin Martin, I don't know if you know her, if you should, if you don't, she's awesome. She is working with the Chicago Public Library. A woman named Evelyn Roning is a researcher on staff at the Science Museum of Minnesota. And then my colleague Annie McNamara, who just successfully defended her dissertation, is working with my friends at practitioners, obviously, so that their voice can really be a central part of this discussion. We're working to develop or generate data that is meaningful, relevant, and useful for them. And in order to have them really use the knowledge and ideas that we design. And we're finding that this is happening, which is very exciting. So interesting thing. So initially when we proposed this idea of developing improvement tools, we thought it would just work for program improvement, and that we would create a tool that would just help improve things, like an evaluation tool. What we found is that it's actually doing a lot of other things, and I'll talk more about that, but things like creating this shared language for learning, both within organizations, but across our field, which is very exciting. Really helping with stakeholder communication, case making and pushing practice in really profound ways. And all of the sites are using these tools for professional development. So training of new staff, evaluating staff, things like that. Our process for developing the tools, kind of overarching process, has been to work with each of these groups to identify learning values that are site-specific, so locally relevant learning values, identify indicators of those values, and then develop a useful and usable observation tool that captures all of this. So, take a second. So I'm going to be talking about the process that we've been engaged in at the Montshire. So as I said, Montshire is a very small science center in rural Vermont. They're small but mighty. They've been at the forefront of the making and learning conversation since it began. What's interesting about the Montshire is making and tinkering is both a programmatic thing in education, but it's also an exhibits thing at their organization. And so it cuts across those two departments. They both do it as a program option sometimes. They have a summer exhibit called the Tinkering Loft, and then they've now seen that there's so much value in it that they integrate a making experience into every new exhibit that they design, no matter the topic. And so we're going to be focusing on this right here, YouTube. So the Montshire's process. So back in the day, in 2014, when they were working across education and exhibits, they worked together to independently articulate their principles, their guiding principles for tinkering at the Montshire. They had these and they used these for a few years, and we used this as our starting point. So they were already kind of, had moved along the path, and they believed in these and felt strongly about them. So what we did was we took these and we took a closer look at them. So we were really trying to take this practice-based approach to think about what's observable and what's not observable when it comes to learning that we value as an organization. And so we saw that within this list of principles, there were some design principles, things that a designer might use and say, we design things that's, this is the things that, the approach we take as designers to support something else. There were observable behaviors that you might call practices. Then there were other kind of like engagement outcomes. And so we worked to kind of tease that apart a little bit. And then we got to a place where we had a list, a list of practices or behaviors that we started with. And we went through an iterative process of trying to figure out, so what does it look like for kids to engage, or learners to engage in these different practices or behaviors? It was a nice process where we would list those things individually. We come together as a group and discuss them. We'd test them on the floor and see, are these things really happening? And we did that over and over and over again. And through that, we came to create this. So this is our current tool. It's in process. And so as the Montshire has been working to identify these values, identify these indicators, create this tool, each of the other organizations has also been doing the same thing. Different values, different indicators. But what's cool is that each of these spaces has somewhat of a similar tool that's emerged, and that's because we've been sharing our work with one another. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the similarities and some of the differences that we're seeing across the tools. So every tool across all of the sites has these high-level values. So for the Montshire, those are inquire, test, iterate, persist, create, and share. Every tool has some way of representing the indicators of those values. So for the Montshire, they're listed as little tick boxes that they can check. For others, it's listed more as a phrase or just kind of on the page. All the tools have space within each of these constructs to write qualitative notes about what they're seeing and what constitutes engagement in those things, or maybe quotes or questions. And every one has something about facilitation, because it's become clear that facilitation is a really essential dimension of making as a learning process. Some of them, like half of them, have some sort of engagement scale. So when you check that something has happened, what if it's happening very intensely? You only check one indicator, but it's happening very intensely. So they wanted some way to kind of represent that. So we have an engagement scale from 1 to 4. So those are some of the features that every tool has shared. The Monshires tool has some interesting features, and every tool has its own unique features. For the Monshire, they really base tinkering within through an engineering lens, and problem solving is an important part of that. And so they wanted something on their tool to represent the importance of that. And so they have this part that says problem learner is solving. But what they mean by that is not the problem that's articulated by the exhibit, but instead the problem that the learner is working on themselves. So it might be different, and making sure that they recognize that in the way that they're capturing learning. The other thing that they really was important to them is that learning is a joyful experience ultimately in a museum context. And so, we were seeing all these indicators and all these constructs, and they were like, this is all well and good, but there's nothing about having fun. And so they wanted a way to capture and compare that. So they have these, I don't know if you can see it, but they're little frowning faces to smiley faces. And so we're just testing this out right now to see, like, what does that tell us? And then there's some things that as a researcher and a member of their team, I'm just sort of like, in that right now, our tool is in process, right? Some constructs have like 15 indicators and some have like 2. So looking across that, we're going to need to, I think that we're going to need to reconcile that at some point and kind of create some uniformity across the number of indicators just so we can more reliably compare them. But it's all a work in process. And we're adding indicators as we test this out. We're taking ones away and collapsing certain ones that maybe we mean the same thing by a similar indicator. So every tool also has this other component that captures some of the more contextual information. So comparative information about the context of learning, the demographics of the visitors that they're observing, and a space for reflective improvement questions. So, as you're using this, what does it make you think about the space? How might we change it? How are you, as an educator feeling? Like, these are some of the questions that are asked on different tools. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're using the tool. And this is super emergent, so you're the first to see this, besides the Monshire folks. So not even the rest of the teams have seen this work. So I'm going to focus on this wind tube. So wind tubes are a tinkering experience that are basically, I would wager to say, in 98% of children's museums, science centers across the country. Often thought about as a tinkering experience, sometimes just thought about as a STEM experience. Air is blown up, you put different objects in the wind tube and you see how they respond to being pushed up by the air. Have you all seen a wind tube before? Yeah. Okay, cool. So for the Monshire, they wanted to use the wind tube as a test case because they weren't sure, is using the wind tube tinkering or is it not tinkering to us as an organization? It's everywhere, but does it really do what we want it to do as a learning experience of tinkering? So their purposes for both creating the tool and testing with the wind tube were to develop this common language that necessarily was cross-departmental for formative evaluation, and as I was talking about, kind of refine the learning goals with respect to tinkering, and for staff and volunteer training. So what I'm going to share was a result of some 40 paired observations. So 20 observations, 40 sheets. They did comparative treatments, which we'll talk a little bit about at the end. That's still kind of we're playing with that a little bit. This was used as a training opportunity for old timers and newbies. So they would pair someone who had been there a long time with an intern or a new educator to do these observations. And they're trying to figure out if this accurately captures and communicates the constructs for their core audience, which is themselves. So this is how the tool is being used. This is just an example of one of the sheets that we've collected. You see they're using the space for, some things are being used, some spaces are being used to make qualitative notes, some are not. There's a question mark. Is this happening? Is it something that we value? Get the idea. So this is what the emergent data has told us. So I'm really focusing on the quantitative stuff, but it's important to know that we've obviously incorporated both the qualitative and quantitative, and we will be looking at the qualitative at some point. This is all super, like I said, emergent descriptive stuff. So, as you can see, there's a lot of inquiry and testing happening, not so much iterating, kind of middling and persisting and creating, and a little bit more sharing. So I showed this data to the core group that we were working with at the Mod Share, and we had a really wonderful discussion. So this is what they said initially. So Amy said, this activity is designed to encourage visitors to iterate. So this shows how problematic that is. There is definitely a disconnect between our design intention and visitor engagement. And then someone else said, we've been wrestling with the concept of iteration anecdotally. This data speaks directly to that. And then someone else said, it should just be about inquiry. I've always believed that. So it's interesting that this data has really provoked them to have these conversations. Now we took a closer look within each of these constructs. And the way that this shows, whether this is the yes or no. It was present or it wasn't present, the high-level construct. And then this is the number of ticks within, so the indicator ticks. So when they saw this, they commented, this says messing around with and exploring materials, this is discovering a principle. So that's interesting. It's great that visitors are messing around with materials, but ultimately we want their inquiry to lead them to discovering a scientific principle that they can test. This makes me ask, what are the materials communicating? So again, it's like digging deeper, changing, problematizing the context for them in actually meaningful ways. So again, that's interesting and useful. This tells me that they are testing their designs over and over again without iterating. They aren't encouraged to make meaningful changes to their designs. So again, I think it's a materials problem. The materials want to play with their designs. So this, they saw that that is low on playful use of tools and materials, and that it's high on testing a thing they made. And what they mean by that is that over and over and over again, just shooting the same thing up into the wind tube and not making any changes to it.
Interesting.
Iterate, obviously very low. Persist, also low. And that encouraged the comment, they aren't encouraged to iterate or make meaningful changes, they're likely not going to persist. This makes sense, but not exactly what you ideally want to see. So again, linking, looking at cross factors. I find this really interesting. Maybe it's because I'm like super deep into it, but and it's just so powerful to see I don't know if you guys can even imagine the light bulbs that were like going off for these guys as they were looking at this data. And then create. So this is a construct that has been challenging for this group. They know that the notion of creativity is something that they want to support, but they're not exactly sure how to characterize it. And I'm sure that many of you in this room wrestle with that too. I know a few of you do specifically, but when I saw this, I didn't have any real, grandiose ideas about what this data was telling me, but when they saw this, they immediately looked at this like small spike, such a small spike around novel solutions. And two different people said, this is super problematic. What are we defining as a novel solution? And someone, that was two different people kind of commented on that. And then, yeah, what's novel to a visitor may not be novel to us. How do we recognize this? So really pushing them to ask important questions, challenge their work. So this is sharing. This shows me that not every exhibit supports or even has to support everything. We don't even offer a way for visitors to document or display the results. Not sure if we should. So this is documenting work and displaying work. So, sometimes a low score is actually really productive, right? It helps you see that, this exhibit doesn't have to support every single construct, and that's the beauty of an exhibition, is that you can have a collection of experiences that together work to support learning. So, in conversation, you probably don't need that. If we decide that this exhibit is about supporting inquiry, then perhaps there's no need for documentation. That's debatable, right? But they said it, and then someone else just said, I'm glad that it provides opportunity for celebration. So the highest one is celebrating in a public space. See, I did it, So again, this is, again, it's not that much data to make any kind of claim, right? But the two conditions that they had, the two treatments. One is their regular treatment, which is for them berry baskets, felt, Velcro strips. I think that's it. So using those materials to create some sort of structure that can resist air in some way. What they developed was this thing called parachute people. And they're these little cardboard people, look like this, and they have holes in their hands. And the ways that they were hoping the design would work, so you can actually just stick a scarf in the holes, and the scarf will just sort of stick there and create a parachute. So you can think for a minute about all the pros and cons of doing something like that, right? At least in my mind, I thought of a lot of cons of kind of constraining the experience in that way, but there were also some pros. And so this helped them think through that a little bit. One thing that they said, that's surprising. So people are less creative and share less with parachute people? And then, someone jumped to a conclusion, well, maybe the parachute people constrain the creativity too much. Maybe it becomes competitive with a more defined goal. So, who knows? This is just the conversation that's emerging, and I find it to be extremely rich in what it's producing. It's helping them take what they knew anecdotally and really put some information on. Do you have a question?
Is it for those two differences, is it just the materials, the people that is different, or is it sort of facilitated or prompted?
Just materials.
Okay.
I should have said that. So all of these observations were unfacilitated by a museum educator. They were oftentimes the facilitation that was documented was by parent or grandparent. And so I can rest on this for a minute if you're interested. So, yeah. So, too fast. Oh, faster than I thought. Anyway, so what we're finding is we're developing an approach to and techniques for identifying, documenting, and most importantly, representing, I think, learning in ways that are meaningful, usable, and useful for practitioners at an individual level, at a programmatic level, an organizational level, and field-wide. And something that I didn't share just for lack of time, but is that we're actually finding alignment and variation of making a learning process, with respect to what is valued by various stakeholders. So we found that across our context, everybody has their own values, but we found that there are actually 4 core dimensions that all of those values kind of align under. I have the slide I could show you later if you're interested. But it is interesting and useful when you think about how do you design professional development, how do you design resources, what are the recommendations you make for design to support learning. There are things that we now know should be considered, or constructs that really are most important to a lot of people. So as you could see just from the Monshires data, that there are major implications for what's happening through this work. Programs are being improved, exhibits are being improved, they have the potential to be improved. Stakeholder communication is happening. At the Chicago Public Library, which is a behemoth organization, I don't even know how many branches they have. The work that they're doing is now being integrated into training of all new staff, and they're devoting like the 2 PD days a year that they have to this, which I find really amazing. People are being promoted that are part of this work because of the work that we're doing. It's huge, right? Professional development, obviously that is happening both internally as well as externally, and probably most importantly, staff empowerment. So the staff is empowered by the use of this data, and they can now speak with authority about, and not even with air quotes, they can speak with authority about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And so that's huge. So our next steps with this work is that we are obviously need to refine these tools a little bit. We're going to be designing them as well to make a whole suite of tools. We will be having an online toolkit, which you'll be able to find eventually at this website. It's not there yet. And we're creating professional development opportunities that will be at various conferences and likely at each of the partner institutions this summer and early fall. So I want to thank you all for listening to me talk, and thank you again to Adam, thank you to IMLS, and yeah, I'm open for questions.